Every single night, 3.5 million truckers roll across America's loneliest highways, driving through the dead hours when most of the world sleeps. They travel routes where cell towers disappear, where the nearest town is 100 miles away, and where the darkness stretches endlessly in every direction. These professional drivers have seen things that would make your blood freeze. Things that happen in the space between mile markers, in the void where civilization ends and something else begins. Tonight, I'm bringing you 9 true accounts from truckers who experienced the unexplainable on America's most isolated roads. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real encounters that left experienced drivers questioning everything they thought they knew about the world. From phantom voices on CB radios to passengers who shouldn't exist, from truck stops that trap you in time to highways that lead to nowhere, these stories will crawl under your skin and make you think twice about every lonely road you've ever traveled. I'm your host at Horror Whispers, and I promise you this: by the time we reach the 9th story, you'll never look at an 18-wheeler on a dark highway the same way again. If you're ready to discover what lurks in the shadows between truck stops, hit that subscribe button now. I've been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Ice storms in Montana, flash floods in Texas, even a tornado that came so close I could feel my trailer lifting off the ground. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me on I-80 in Nebraska last October. I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Denver to Chicago, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of construction delays in Colorado. It was just past midnight when I hit that long, empty stretch of highway between North Platte and Grand Island. You know the one. Nothing but cornfields and darkness for miles, with maybe 1 or 2 other trucks every half hour. The kind of road that makes you feel like you're the last person alive on Earth. That's when I first noticed something wrong with my mirrors. At first I thought it was just the usual road fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. You drive long enough at night, and shadows start looking like things they're not. But when I glanced in my passenger side mirror to check my trailer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing in the back of my trailer, clearly visible through the rear doors that I knew damn well were locked tight. He was tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit and tie. His face was pale as moonlight, and he was staring directly at me through the mirror with these black, empty eyes that seemed to look right through my soul. When I jerked my head around to look directly at the trailer, there was nothing there, just my load strapped down tight like always. But when I looked back in the mirror, he was still there, still staring, still perfectly motionless. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a grimy little place called Pete's Fuel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely get the keys out of the ignition. I walked around to the back of my trailer, expecting to find nothing but needing to check anyway. The doors were still locked, the seal was intact, and when I opened them up, everything was exactly as I'd loaded it in Denver. Machinery parts, all accounted for. No sign that anyone had been back there. I figured I was just more tired than I thought, so I grabbed a coffee and a candy bar from the vending machine and tried to shake it off. But when I climbed back into my cab, the man was there again, visible only in the mirror. This time he raised one pale hand and waved at me, slow and deliberate, like he was greeting an old friend. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The man in the mirror was wearing my face. Not exactly my face, mind you, but close enough to be my brother. Or maybe what I'd look like if I died 20 years ago. and been buried in that fancy suit. Same nose, but his skin was gray and waxy, and those eyes. Christ, those eyes were like looking into an empty grave. I floored it out of that truck stop, pushing my rig harder than I'd ever pushed it before. 85, 90 miles an hour on that empty highway, trying to outrun something that was apparently traveling with me. But every time I checked my mirrors, he was still there. Sometimes standing, sometimes sitting on my load, always wearing that same calm expression like he had all the time in the world. The really sick part was that other drivers started noticing. My CB crackled to life around 2 in the morning. And this voice I didn't recognize said, "Hey there, Peterbilt with the Illinois plates. You got a passenger back there?" I grabbed the mic so fast I nearly dropped it. "What do you mean, driver?" I asked, hoping against hope he was talking about someone else. "Got a fellow in a suit standing in your trailer?" came the reply. "Thought you might want to know he's back there." 3 different drivers reported seeing him over the next hour. One said he was waving. Another said he was pointing at something. The third driver, an old-timer with a voice like gravel, said something that still gives me nightmares. "That ain't no living man back there, son. That's something else wearing a man's shape." I tried everything I could think of. I stopped at 2 more truck stops, checked my load each time, even called my dispatcher to see if maybe someone had screwed up the paperwork and loaded a passenger along with my freight. Nothing. According to everyone else, I was hauling exactly what I was supposed to be hauling, and nobody had any business being in my trailer. But the mirror man was still there. Around 4 in the morning, somewhere outside of Lincoln, he started moving. Not just waving or pointing, but actually walking around in my trailer like he owned the place. I watched in horror as he examined my load, running his pale hands over the machinery parts like he was looking for something specific. Then he turned and looked directly at me through the mirror, and I swear to God, he smiled. That's when he started to change. His suit began to fade, replaced by the flannel shirt and jeans I was wearing. His hair shifted from black to brown, matching mine exactly. His face became more and more like my own until I was looking at a perfect reflection of myself, standing in the back of my own trailer. But this version of me had those same dead black eyes, and that same knowing smile that seemed to say he understood something I didn't. The other me raised his hand and pressed it against what would have been the inside of the mirror. I felt compelled to do the same, reaching out to touch my passenger side mirror. The glass was ice cold, so cold it burned my fingertips. And for just a moment, I could swear I felt another hand pressing back from the other side. That's when I understood what was happening. The mirror wasn't showing me someone in my trailer. It was showing me something trying to get out of the mirror itself. Something that had been watching me, learning from me, becoming me. And now, it wanted to trade places. I jerked my hand back and covered all my mirrors with my spare towels, driving the remaining 200 miles to Chicago by instinct and GPS alone. When I finally reached the delivery dock, I was shaking like a leaf and probably looked like I'd seen a ghost. Which in a way, I guess I had. The dock workers unloaded my trailer without incident, and I inspected every inch of it afterward. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, but I haven't looked at my mirrors the same way since. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through the empty stretches of highway, I catch myself wondering if the thing I saw was really trying to get out, or if maybe, just maybe, it succeeded. Because lately, my reflection has been looking back at me a little too knowingly, and smiling just a little too wide. I've been running freight between Kansas City and Denver for 15 years, and I know every mile of I-70 like the back of my hand. Every truck stop, every way station, every speed trap between Missouri and Colorado. I know which exit has the cleanest restrooms, which fuel stop has the strongest coffee, and which stretches of highway are best avoided during certain times of the year. But what I didn't know, until that August night in 2003, was that some voices on the CB radio never really go silent, even when they should have been quiet for 20 years. I was hauling grain to Colorado, making decent time despite the late hour. It was just past midnight, and the interstate was mostly empty, except for the occasional eastbound truck and a few cars pushing the speed limit. My CB had been quiet for the better part of an hour, just the usual background static and the distant chatter of drivers comparing fuel prices or warning about state troopers. I had the radio turned down low, more for company than anything else, when Channel 19 suddenly crackled to life with a voice I'd never heard before. Breaker 19, this is Road King Charlie, eastbound mile 99. Got a situation here. Anybody copy? The voice was strained, desperate in a way that made me sit up straighter in my seat. There's a certain tone drivers get when they're in real trouble, and this guy had it in spades. I grabbed my mic without hesitation. Go ahead. Road King Charlie. This is Cornhusker running westbound. What's your 20? And what's your situation? The response came back immediately, filled with static but clear enough to understand. Mile marker 99. Eastbound I-70. My rigs broke down. Engine seized up completely. I'm hurt bad here, driver. Real bad. Need someone to green numbers in the darkness of my cab. Mile 99 was about 15 minutes ahead of my current position. I'll be there in a few minutes, Charlie. What's the nature of your injuries? You having chest pains, bleeding? What am I looking at here? There's something wrong with this place, driver. The air don't smell right, and I keep hearing things moving around outside my cab. Please, don't leave me here, man. I've been waiting so long for someone to help. His voice was getting weaker, more frantic, and I found myself pushing my Peterbilt harder than I should have been, watching my speedometer climb past 80. The transmission cut to pure static, and I tried raising him again. Road King Charlie, this is Cornhusker. Do you copy? Charlie, what's your handle on that truck? What are you driving? Nothing but white noise came back through the speaker. I kept trying every few minutes as I closed the distance, but the radio stayed silent except for the occasional burst of static that almost sounded like someone trying to speak through interference. When I reached mile 99, I slowed down and started scanning both sides of the highway with my headlights and flashers going. The eastbound side was completely empty, nothing but dark asphalt stretching into the distance. I pulled onto the shoulder and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from behind my seat, the kind that could light up a football field, walking the guardrail for a quarter mile in each direction. I called out for Charlie, listening for any response, any sign of a broken-down truck or an injured driver. The only sounds were my own footsteps on gravel and the distant hum of traffic. I climbed back into my cab, confused and worried. Maybe I'd misunderstood the mile marker, or maybe Charlie had managed to get his truck running again and limped to the next exit. I keyed my mic and tried one more time. Breaker 19, this is Cornhusker at mile 99, Road King Charlie. You out there? I'm here looking for you, buddy. The response came through, crystal clear, clearer than any CB transmission I'd ever heard. Cornhusker, you there? I can see your headlights. I'm right here, man, right here waving at you. I looked around wildly, checking every direction, but the highway was completely empty. Not a single vehicle in sight, not even distant tail lights disappearing over the horizon. Charlie, I don't see you anywhere, buddy. Where exactly are you located? What kind of truck you driving? I was starting to get that cold feeling in my gut, the one that tells you something is very wrong with the situation you've gotten yourself into. I'm driving a blue Kenworth cab over, Nebraska plates that read Big Rig. Got a busted windshield and the hood's up. I'm bleeding pretty bad here, Cornhusker. I can see you sitting. Hollow echo. like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. My hand started shaking as I reached for my logbook, flipping to the back pages where I kept newspaper clippings about highway accidents. It's a morbid habit that most long-haul drivers develop, keeping track of crashes and fatalities on the routes we travel regularly. I found what I was looking for in a yellowed clipping from the Salina Journal, dated August 22, 1983. The headline read, "Local trucker dies in I-70 accident," and the article described how Charles Morrison, age 42, had crashed his blue Kenworth cab over at mile 99. The truck had caught fire after hitting a guardrail, and Morrison had died before emergency responders could reach the scene. 20 years ago, to the day. "Cornhusker, why won't you help me? I can see you right there. Please, I've been waiting so long." The voice was getting fainter now, more distant, but the desperation remained. "It's so cold here, and I can't get out of my truck. The door's jammed, and there's smoke everywhere." I keyed my mic with trembling fingers, not sure what to say to a dead man who didn't know he was dead. Charlie Morrison, this is going to sound impossible, but you need to listen to me. You died in 1983, buddy. There was a fire. You've been gone for 20 years. The silence that followed stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. When Charlie's voice came back, it was different, sadder, more distant, like an echo of an echo. "The fire. I remember the fire. I couldn't get the door open. I kept calling for help, but nobody would stop. They all just drove by. I'm sorry, Charlie. I'm so sorry nobody stopped to help you." I meant it too. The thought of dying alone on a dark highway, calling for help that never comes, was every trucker's nightmare. Will you remember me? Will you tell people that Charlie Morrison was here, that he tried to get help?" His voice was barely a whisper now, fading like a radio station going out of range. "I'll remember," I promised. "Every time I drive past mile 99, I'll remember Charlie Morrison." The radio went completely silent after that, and I sat there for another hour, waiting for him to come back. But Charlie never transmitted again, at least not that night. As dawn started painting the Kansas sky pink and orange, I continued west toward Denver, but I couldn't shake the image of a man trapped in a burning truck, calling desperately for help that would never arrive in time. I've driven past mile 99 hundreds of times since then, and every August 22nd, I listen to my CB extra carefully. Other drivers have reported hearing Charlie's voice over the years, always the same desperate call for help, always from mile 99. The highway department says there's nothing special about that. Accidents leave more than just skid marks and broken glass. They leave voices that echo across the years, still calling for help, still hoping that this time someone will stop. And every time I pass mile 99, I slow down just a little and keep my eyes open, because Charlie Morrison is still out there, still waiting for help. That's 20 years too late. Straightforward. I've been driving trucks for 12 years, hauling everything from auto parts to electronics across the southwestern United States. And I thought I'd seen every kind of weird weather phenomenon the desert could throw at me. Dust devils that could flip an empty trailer, lightning storms that turned the sky purple, mirages that made you think you were seeing lakes where there was nothing but sand and scrub brush. But what happened to me on I-40 west of Albuquerque in September of 2001 wasn't weather, and it sure as hell wasn't natural. I was hauling a load of computer equipment from Los Angeles to Dallas, running about 3 hours behind schedule because of a delayed pickup. My dispatcher was breathing down my neck about delivery times, so I was pushing harder than usual through the New Mexico desert, trying to make up time on those long, empty stretches where you can see for miles in every direction. It was just past 11 at night, and the sky was so clear you could see every star in the Milky Way. No moon that night, which made the desert look like an endless black ocean stretching away from my headlights. That's when I first spotted them in my mirrors. 3 points of light, maybe half a mile back, keeping perfect pace with my truck. At first glance, I figured it was just another convoy running late like me, maybe trying to avoid the way stations by running with minimal lighting. It wouldn't have been the first time I'd seen drivers trying to slip past DOT inspections by keeping their marker lights dim. But after about 20 minutes of watching these lights stay exactly the same distance behind me, even when I varied my speed from 65 to 75 miles per hour, I started paying closer attention. I grabbed my CB mic and keyed it. Breaker 19, this is Desert Rose, westbound on I-40, mile 140. Got 3 trucks running dark behind me. Y'all need to get your marker lights on before a bear sees you and writes you up for equipment violations. I waited for a response, listening to the usual chatter from other drivers talking about fuel prices and road conditions, but nobody acknowledged my call. The convoy behind me stayed silent, which was unusual. Most truckers are pretty good about responding to safety warnings, especially when it comes to avoiding tickets. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. These weren't the usual amber and red marker lights you see on trucks. These lights were pure white, bright as around in glass globes. They pulsed slightly, not like turn signals or hazard lights, but with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. I'd never seen anything like them on any truck, and I'd been around commercial vehicles my entire adult life. I decided to test them, slowing down to 60 miles per hour to see if they'd pass me or at least close the distance. The lights maintained their exact spacing, still half a mile back, still pulsing in that weird synchronized pattern. Then I sped up to 80, pushing my Freightliner harder than I probably should have with a full load. The lights kept pace effortlessly, never getting closer, never falling behind, like they were connected to my truck by some invisible tether. That's when things got really strange. The 3 lights suddenly separated. One veered left toward the desert, one went right, and the middle one shot straight up into the star-filled sky before disappearing completely. I actually rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was more tired than I'd realized. But when I looked back in my mirrors, the remaining 2 lights were now pacing me on either side of the highway, maybe 50 yards out in the scrub brush. I could see them clearly now in my peripheral vision, and they definitely weren't attached to any vehicle. They were floating about 6 feet off the ground, moving at exactly my speed over terrain that would have stopped any truck dead in its tracks. Up close, they looked even stranger, not quite round, more like teardrops of liquid fire that shifted and flowed while maintaining their basic shape. And they were definitely pulsing in sync with each other, like 2 parts of the same organism. My CB crackled to life with a gravelly voice I didn't recognize. Breaker 19, this is Moondog eastbound. Desert Rose, you copy. I grabbed the mic so fast I almost dropped it. Go ahead, Moondog. Lady, I just passed your 20 and I gotta ask, what in Sam Hill you got following you out there? Looks like a couple of UFOs playing escort to your trailer, so I wasn't losing my mind. Another driver could see them too. You tell me, Moondog. They've been pacing me for the last hour. Never seen anything like it. Roger that. Bright as Vegas signs floating alongside your rig like they own the place. I've been driving these roads for 30 years, and I ain't never seen nothing like what's following you, lady. The lights suddenly accelerated, shooting ahead of my truck like they'd been fired from a cannon. I watched through my windshield as they hovered over the highway about a quarter mile ahead, waiting for me. As I approached, they rose higher, passed directly over my cab with a strange humming sound that I felt more than heard, and settled back into their escort positions behind me. The temperature in my cab dropped at least 15 degrees when they passed overhead, and my radio filled with static so loud I had to turn the volume for the next 60 miles. The lights would race ahead, hover over the road like they were inspecting it, wait for me to pass underneath them, then resume their positions. Each time they passed over my truck, I got that same bone-deep chill in the radio interference. My fuel gauge started fluctuating wildly, jumping from 3/4 full to nearly empty and back again. The digital clock on my dashboard began displaying impossible times. 25:73, 38:41, 99:99. By the time I reached the truck stop in Amarillo, I was shaking like a leaf. The lights followed me right into the parking lot, hovering at the edge of the property like they were respecting some invisible boundary. Other drivers were already gathering, pointing and taking pictures, though I later learned that none of the photos turned out, just bright smears against dark backgrounds, like someone had waved a flashlight in front of the camera. An old-timer named Buck walked over to my truck, shaking his head in amazement. 37 years I've been driving, he said, and I've seen ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, even a tornado once. But those things out there, they're watching you, honey. Real question is why they picked you. I didn't have an answer for him. Hell, I didn't have answers for any of it. I finished fueling and grabbed a quick shower, hoping the lights would get bored and move on to someone else. But when I came out of the truck stop, there were 5 of them instead of 2. And they seemed brighter, more active, pulsing faster like they were excited about something. The other drivers had mostly dispersed, but a few were still hanging around, smoking cigarettes and staring at my otherworldly escort. The lights followed me until dawn. As the first rays of sunlight painted the Texas panhandle gold and pink, they began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible. By the time I reached Dallas for my delivery, they were gone completely, leaving me to wonder if any of it had actually happened. I never saw those lights again. But every time I drive through New Mexico at night, I keep one eye on my mirrors and another on the desert around me. Because whatever those things were, wherever they came from, I have the distinct feeling they're still out there, watching the highways, choosing who to follow and who to leave alone. And sometimes, when the desert is particularly dark and the stars are particularly bright, I think I can see them in the distance, patient, silent, waiting for the right truck, the right driver, the right night to begin their strange escort service once again. I should have listened to the warnings. Every veteran driver on the I-80 corridor knows about mile-mark rest area or truck stop. Even if your rig is falling apart around you, but I was young and stubborn and thought I knew better than a bunch of superstitious old-timers spinning ghost stories around truck stop coffee. My name is Danny Crawford, and I'd been driving for about 5 years when this happened, back in November of 1999. I was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Sacramento, running a tight schedule with barely enough time to make my delivery window. I'd heard the stories about Mile 242, sure, but I figured they were just the usual highway legends that get passed around when drivers have too much time and too much caffeine. Every road has its supposedly haunted stretches, its mysterious accidents, its unexplained phenomena. I'd driven past Mile 242 dozens of times without incident. So when my rear trailer tire blew out, just as my odometer clicked past mile 241, I didn't think twice about pulling over to change it. The tire went with that distinctive bang that every trucker dreads, followed by the grinding sound of rubber separating from the rim. My trailer lurched to the right, and I had to fight the wheel to keep my rig from jackknifing across both lanes of traffic. My CB immediately crackled with concern from other drivers who'd seen me weaving. Breaker 19, this is Midnight Express. Looks like you got tire trouble there, driver. I keep my mic and confirmed that I'd blown a steer tire and would need to pull over to change it. That's when the warnings started. Negative on that, Midnight Express. You're coming up on mile 242. Keep rolling till you hit the next rest area, even if you're running on the rim. The voice belonged to someone I didn't recognize, but there was an urgency in it that made me pay attention. Before I could respond, other voices chimed in over the CB, all saying variations of the same thing. Don't stop at mile 242. Bad things happen there. Keep moving, no matter what. But I was already slowing down, looking for a safe spot on the shoulder. And my tire was disintegrating fast enough that I knew I wouldn't make it another 20 miles. I found a relatively flat stretch of shoulder just past the mile marker and pulled over, despite the increasingly frantic warnings coming through my radio. Don't do it, driver. Mile 242's cursed, man. That place ain't right. I figured they were just hazing the new, positioning my jack when I noticed the other truck parked about 50 yards ahead of me on the shoulder. It was a red Kenworth conventional, and even from a distance I could tell it was in pristine condition. The chrome bumpers gleamed like mirrors, the paint job looked fresh from the factory, and the running lights were casting a warm amber glow across the asphalt. Steam was rising from the exhaust stack, indicating the engine was still running. I walked toward the truck, thinking I'd introduce myself to a fellow driver and maybe get some help changing my tire. Company would be nice out here in the middle of nowhere, and most truckers are pretty good about lending a hand when someone's broken down. But as I got closer, something started feeling wrong about the whole situation. The truck was too clean, too perfect, like it had never been driven in anger or loaded with a real cargo. There wasn't a single bug splat on the windshield, not a speck of road grime on the wheel wells, not even any wear on the tires. In 15 years of being around commercial vehicles, first as a mechanic and then as a driver, I'd never seen a long-haul truck that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. I approached the driver's side and knocked on the door, calling out to whoever was inside. No response. I knocked harder, then tried the door handle, but it was locked tight. Walking around to the passenger side, I found that door locked as well, but through the windows, I could see that the cab was completely empty. No driver. No personal belongings, no logbooks or paperwork scattered across the dashboard. Just clean vinyl seats and pristine interior surfaces that looked like they'd never been touched by human hands. The engine was definitely running. I could hear the diesel rumbling and see the exhaust vapor, but there was nobody in the truck to be running it. My CB crackled to life, and I heard a voice I recognized from earlier. "Danny, you there? What's your situation?" I jogged back to my own truck and grabbed the mic. "There's another rig here, but nobody's in it. Engine's running, doors are locked, but the cab is empty. Strangest thing I've ever seen." The response came immediately, and the voice was more serious than I'd ever heard from another trucker. "Danny, listen to me very carefully. That truck has been sitting there since 1976. Don't touch it any more than you already have, and get the hell away from mile 242 as fast as you can." That was 23 years ago. I looked back at the Kenworth, and now I noticed things I'd missed before. There were no tire tracks leading up to where it was parked, no footprints in the gravel around the cab, no oil stains or fluid leaks underneath the chassis. It was as if the truck had simply materialized there, fully formed and perfectly preserved, like some kind of automotive ghost ship floating on a sea of asphalt. The CB voice continued, telling me about a drive at mile 242 in 1976 to check his load securement. When the state police found his truck the next morning, the engine was still running, and the doors were locked from the inside. But Pete had vanished without a trace. No footprints leading away from the truck, no sign of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. The truck was impounded and eventually sold at auction, but Pete Kowalski was never seen again. And according to the CB voice, drivers had been reporting sightings of that same red Kenworth ever since. Always parked at mile 242, always with the engine running, always empty. As I stood there, staring at the impossible truck, the temperature began dropping rapidly. I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and frost was actually forming on my windshield, despite the fact that it had been a relatively mild November evening when I'd pulled over. The red Kenworth's running lights seemed to pulse brighter, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a silhouette in the driver's seat, a figure in a trucker's cap and jacket, sitting perfectly still with his hands on the steering wheel. I didn't bother changing my tire. I climbed back into my cab, fired up the engine, and drove the next 40 miles on a wheel that should have disintegrated after the first quarter mile. Other drivers later told me they saw my rig throwing sparks and chunks of rubber, but somehow that destroyed tire held together long enough to get me to the next truck stop. The mechanic who eventually looked at the damage couldn't explain how I'd managed to drive so far on what was essentially a bare rim with a few strips of steel-belted radials still clinging to it. I never went back to mile 242, but I've heard from other drivers who have. They all report the same thing. A pristine red Kenworth conventional, engine idling, doors locked, cab empty except for the occasional glimpse of a figure behind the wheel. Some say it's Pete Kowalski, still trying to complete whatever delivery he was making in 1976. Others think it's something else entirely, something that uses the appearance of a familiar truck to lure unsuspecting drivers into stopping where they shouldn't. But all of them agree on one thing. Mile 242 is a place where the normal rules don't apply, where time moves differently, and where some drivers never really leave the road. My name is Marcus Williams, and I've been driving 18-wheelers for 16 years. I've hauled everything from frozen seafood to hazardous chemicals across every state in the continental U.S., and I thought I'd seen every kind of weird thing the highway could throw at me. Drunk drivers, police chases, even a bank robbery where I accidentally got caught in the middle of a high-speed pursuit through 3 counties. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me at rest stop number 13 on I-75 near Tifton, Georgia, in the summer of 2004. I was pushing hard from Miami to Atlanta with a load of frozen shrimp and grouper that couldn't afford any delays. My dispatcher had made it clear that this customer was important, and any temperature excursions or late deliveries would come out of my paycheck. It was 2:30 in the morning when I saw the blue signs for rest stop number 13, and I desperately needed coffee and a bathroom break. I'd been fighting to stay awake for the last hour, relying on truck stop coffee that had gone cold and bitter. And I knew I was pushing my luck trying to make Atlanta without a proper rest. The rest stop was one of those newer facilities that Georgia had been building, all marble floors and fancy fixtures that looked more like a hotel lobby than a highway rest area. When I was starting out, rest stops were just cinder block buildings with vending machines and hopefully working toilets. But this place had granite countertops, automatic soap dispensers, and lighting that was bright enough to perform surgery. There were only a couple of RVs and one other semi parked in the far corner when I pulled in, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. I parked under one of the security lights and headed for the building, my boots echoing on the empty sidewalk. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and I walked into what felt like a cathedral of fluorescent lighting. Everything was spotlessly clean, almost sterile, and my footsteps seemed to echo forever in the vast space. I made my way to the coffee machine, dropped in my quarters, and selected the strongest brew available. While the machine gurgled and hissed, I looked around at the rest stop's amenities: tourist information racks, a small gift shop area, and those ubiquitous vending machines filled with overpriced snacks and energy drinks. That's when I noticed something odd about the mirrors in the restroom area. They were slightly tinted, giving everything a greenish hue that reminded me of looking through old bottle glass. When I moved my hand to test it, my reflection seemed to follow a split second later, like watching a badly synchronized video call. I chalked it up to cheap mirrors and poor installation, but it gleamed like they'd never been used, and everything had that antiseptic smell of industrial-strength cleaning products. But those mirrors continued to bother me. The delay in the reflection was more pronounced now, and the greenish tint made my skin look sickly and pale. I splashed some water on my face, dried off with paper towels, and got out of there as quickly as possible. When I emerged from the restroom, I nearly dropped my coffee cup. There was another man standing at the coffee machine, wearing the exact same clothes I was wearing, with the same 5 o'clock shadow and the same tired expression I'd been wearing all night. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and smiled with my own face. "Long night, huh?" he said in my voice, using the exact inflection I would have used. I stood there with my mouth hanging open, unable to process what I was seeing. "Who are you? What is this?" "I'm you, obviously," the duplicate said, continuing to operate the coffee machine with my exact movements and mannerisms. "Just finished using the restroom. These mirrors are weird, aren't they? All green and delayed, like looking through water." My heart started hammering against my ribs. "This isn't possible. This isn't real." "Of course it's real. I'm as real as you are." The other Marcus took a sip of coffee and made the same face I always made when truck stop coffee was too bitter. "Maybe more real, actually. I've been thinking about that load of seafood we're hauling. We're cutting it close on time, aren't we? Maybe we should call dispatch, let them know we might be running a few minutes behind schedule." "How do you know about my cargo?" I demanded, backing toward the entrance doors. "Because I'm you, remember? I know everything you know. Your route, your delivery time, your social security number. That scar on your left hand from when you cut yourself changing a tire in Bakersfield 3 years ago." He held up his left hand, and sure enough, there was the same scar I'd carried since that incident. I turned and ran for the exit doors, but they wouldn't budge. The exit sign was clearly lit, but the automatic doors seemed to be sealed shut. I pushed against them with all my strength, but they might as well have been welded in place. Behind me, I could hear my own voice speaking calmly. "Looking for a way out? Why would you want to leave? This is a nice place. Clean, well-lit, plenty of coffee. And the best part is, you never have to worry about deadlines again. Time doesn't really work the same way here." I looked at my watch, and the hands were spinning wildly, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, sometimes just vibrating in place like they couldn't decide which direction to go. The digital display on the coffee machine kept changing too. 2:33 a.m., 11:47 p.m., 6:15 a.m., 1:03 p.m. Numbers that made no sense in any sequence I could understand. Glitch in reality. A fold in space where the highway department accidentally built a facility that doesn't quite exist in normal time and space. Others think it's something older, something that was here before the interstate system, just wearing new clothes to blend in with modern expectations. More figures began emerging from the shadows around the rest stop, and every single one of them had my face. Some looked younger, some older, some were wearing different clothes, but they all had my features, my posture, my mannerisms. It was like looking into a hall of mirrors, except each reflection was slightly different, slightly wrong. "Every time someone stops here," the original duplicate explained, "a piece of them stays behind, and every piece that stays becomes real, becomes part of the collection. Welcome to the club, Marcus. You're going to like it here. We all do." The next thing I knew, I was standing outside by my truck in the morning sunlight, holding an empty coffee cup with no memory of how I'd gotten there. According to my watch, I'd been inside for exactly 3 minutes, just long enough to use the restroom and grab a coffee. I climbed into my cab, fired up the engine, and drove straight to Atlanta, making my delivery right on schedule. For 3 days, I tried to convince myself it had been a weird dream, brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Then, my dispatcher called with some disturbing news. "Marcus, I got a complaint from rest stop number 13 down in Georgia. Their security footage shows you entering the building at 2:33 a.m., but there's no footage of you leaving. The facility manager wants to know if you're okay, if maybe you had some kind of medical emergency." I hung up the phone and pulled out my road atlas, planning new routes that would take me around Georgia entirely, because I knew that somewhere in rest stop number 13, there's still a version of me wandering around, trying to find a way out of a place that exists in all times and none at all. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through unfamiliar territory, I wonder if the Marcus who made it out was the real one, or just another reflection that managed to escape the mirrors. My name is Robert Chen, and I've been an owner-operator for 8 years, hauling computer equipment and electronics up and down the West Coast. I pride myself on being a rational man, someone who deals in facts and schedules and delivery deadlines. I don't believe in ghost stories or highway legends or any of the supernatural nonsense that some drivers like to share over coffee at truck stops. At least, my delivery window. The weather had been clear when I left South Dakota, but somewhere around sunset, one of those sudden prairie storms rolled in like the wrath of God. The sky turned black as coal. The wind started howling hard enough to rock my loaded trailer, and then the rain began falling in sheets so thick I could barely see the road ahead of my headlights. I had to slow down to about 40 miles per hour just to stay on the asphalt, and even then I was white-knuckling the steering wheel to keep my rig from getting pushed around by the crosswinds. That's when I first saw her. A figure, walking along the shoulder of the highway, heading west, against the wind and rain. She was wearing a bright red raincoat with the hood pulled up, walking at a steady, measured pace that never seemed to change despite the storm raging around her. My first thought was that she had to be out of her mind to be walking in weather like this, miles from any town or shelter. My second thought was that I should call it in on my CB, warn other drivers that there was a pedestrian out there who was going to get herself killed if she wasn't careful. I grabbed my mic and keyed it. Breaker 19. This is Pacific Express westbound mile 220. Got a pedestrian walking the shoulder in this storm. Y'all be extra careful out here. Looks like someone's having car trouble or something. A few drivers acknowledged my call, but as I continued west, fighting the wind and rain, I kept seeing her. Every few minutes my headlights would sweep across that bright red raincoat, always the same distance ahead of me, always walking at that same unnaturally steady pace. After about an hour of this, I started paying closer attention to the woman in the red coat. She never seemed to get tired, never stopped to rest or seek shelter under an overpass, never even turned to look at the traffic passing her. She just walked, straight and purposeful, like she had somewhere very important to be, and nothing, not wind, not rain, not the danger of being hit by a truck, was going to stop her from getting there. The wind was strong enough to push my 80,000-pound rig around the road, but it didn't seem to affect her at all. Her pace never varied, her posture never changed, and that red coat never even fluttered in the gale-force winds. I tried passing her several times, speeding up to 50 or even 60 miles per hour, despite the dangerous conditions. But somehow she always stayed just ahead of my headlights. When I slowed down, she seemed to slow down too, maintaining that same maddening distance between us. It was like she was pacing me, matching her speed to mine in a way that should have kept going in this weather. There was a pause before Thunder Road responded. I just passed your 20, driver, and I didn't see nobody walking out there. Just empty road and rain. That's when the storm suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not slowly tapering off like storms usually do, but instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The rain stopped mid-drop, the wind died to nothing, and my wipers started squeaking against dry windshield. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. The road ahead was empty. No sign of the woman in the red raincoat anywhere. But then, I checked my rear-view mirror, and there she was, behind me now, still walking west, still maintaining that same mechanical pace. How had she gotten behind me? I hadn't passed her, hadn't seen her cross the road, hadn't lost sight of her for more than a few seconds, but somehow, she was behind my truck, walking in the same direction I was traveling, keeping perfect pace with my vehicle. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a run-down place called Jerry's Fuel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. My hands were shaking as I climbed out of my cab, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that red raincoat somewhere in the parking lot. The other drivers inside were talking about the sudden storm, comparing notes about how it had come out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. When I mentioned the woman I'd seen walking in the rain, they all looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Wasn't nobody walking out there in that weather," said an old-timer named Earl. "Hell, wasn't hardly anybody driving in it either. You sure you didn't just see a reflector post or a road sign or something?" But I knew what I'd seen. A woman in a bright red raincoat, walking steadily through a storm that should have knocked her flat, maintaining an impossible pace for an impossible distance. I got back on the road after about an hour, hoping I'd left whatever weirdness had been following me back at the truck stop. But 20 minutes later, there she was again, in my headlights, walking ahead of me on the shoulder, like she'd never stopped. This time, I could see more details. The red raincoat was old-fashioned, the kind with a belt and big buttons that went out of style in the 70s. Her walking style was strange too, perfectly rhythmic, like a metronome, with no variation. Said it was more of a burgundy or maroon. It was like we were all seeing different versions of the same impossible woman. Just before dawn, somewhere outside of Mitchell, she finally stopped. I was watching her in my passenger side mirror when she came to a halt next to a concrete mile marker. For the first time since I'd been seeing her, she turned to look directly at me. Even from a distance, even in the dim light of early morning, I could see her face clearly. She was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you might see on someone who knows a secret you don't want to know. Someone who's been waiting a very long time for exactly the right moment to share it with you. She raised one hand and waved at me, slow and deliberate, like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. Then she turned and walked directly into the prairie grass, disappearing into the tall wheat like she'd never been there at all. I never saw her again. But I hear stories from other drivers sometimes. A woman in a red raincoat walking impossible distances at impossible speeds, appearing in storms and disappearing at dawn. Some say she's the ghost of a woman who died in a car accident in the 70s, still trying to walk home from wherever she was going that night. Others think she's something else entirely. Something that uses the shape of a woman to hide its true nature. But all the stories agree on one thing. If you see her walking alongside your truck, she's not really walking with you. She's leading you somewhere you don't want to go. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for 19 years. I've seen convoys before. Sometimes 20 or 30 trucks running together for safety or companionship. Their headlights stretching out behind you like a chain of stars on the dark highway. There's something comforting about being part of a convoy, knowing you're not alone out there in the endless night. But what I saw in my mirrors on I-70 in Kansas during the winter of 2005 wasn't comfort. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced on the road. I was running a load of agricultural equipment from Omaha to Denver, fighting through one of those brutal February blizzards that can shut down half the interstate system. The snow was coming down so hard my wipers could barely keep up, and the wind was howling across the Kansas plains like something unleashed from hell itself. I'd been debating whether to pull over and wait it out, but my delivery. First, I was relieved to see other drivers brave enough to keep moving in these conditions. There's safety in numbers during a blizzard, and knowing there were other professionals out there navigating the same treacherous conditions made me feel less alone. I counted at least 12 rigs in the convoy, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow like beacons in the darkness. I grabbed my CB mic to establish contact with the convoy. Breaker 19, this is Cornfield Express, westbound mile 180. Got a convoy behind me. Y'all doing okay back there? I waited for a response, listening to the usual static and interference that winter weather brings to radio transmissions. But there was no reply, just the hiss of empty airwaves and the distant chatter of other drivers dealing with their own problems. I tried again, using channel 17 and then channel 21, but the convoy remained silent. That was unusual. Most convoys maintain constant radio contact to coordinate speeds, share road conditions, and warn each other about hazards. But these drivers seemed content to follow without communication, which struck me as odd but not necessarily alarming. Maybe they were running a specialized cargo that required radio silence, or maybe their equipment was malfunctioning in the storm. As I continued west, fighting the increasingly treacherous conditions, I kept checking my mirrors to make sure the convoy was still there. They maintained perfect formation, staying exactly the same distance behind me, never closing the gap or falling farther back despite the varying conditions of the road. When I slowed down for a particularly bad stretch of ice, they slowed down too. When I sped up on a clearer section, they matched my pace exactly. It was like they were connected to my truck by some invisible tether. After about an hour, I started noticing strange details about the convoy in my mirrors. The trucks all looked identical. Same make, same model, same color scheme. Like they'd rolled off an assembly line yesterday, their headlights had an odd quality too. Brighter and whiter than normal halogen bulbs, with a cold intensity that reminded me of surgical lighting. And despite the blizzard conditions, I never saw any snow accumulating on their windshields or hoods, as if the storm was somehow avoiding them. My CB suddenly crackled to life with a transmission from another driver. Cornfield Express, this is Big Rig Betty eastbound. Just past your 20, and I gotta ask, what's with the parade behind you? I keyed my mic immediately. You can see them too, Betty? I count about 12 trucks running convoy formation. They've been following me for the last hour. There was a long pause before she responded. Driver, I'm looking at your rig right now, and there ain't nothing behind you but empty road and snow. You feeling okay up there? I looked in my mirrors, and the convoy was still there, clear as day. 12 identical headlights, maintaining perfect formation through the storm. Betty, they're right there behind me. I can see them plain as day. Another pause, then. Cornfield Express, I'm going to suggest you pull over at the next truck stop and get some rest. This storm's got everybody a little spooked, but there ain't no convoy behind you, driver. Trust me on this one. But I knew what I was seeing. The convoy was there, following me through the worst blizzard I'd ever driven through, maintaining their impossible formation, despite conditions that should have scattered any group of trucks across miles of highway. I tried raising them on every CB channel, tried flashing my brake lights to get their attention, even tried slowing down to force them to pass me. Nothing worked. They stayed exactly where they were, following at that same precise distance, like ghosts made of steel and chrome. As the hours passed, I began to notice that the convoy was growing. What had started as 12 trucks was now 15, then 18, then 24. New rigs were somehow joining the formation from behind, appearing out of the storm like they'd materialized from the snow itself. They all had the same impossible cleanliness, the same bright white headlights, the same eerie silence on the radio waves. The storm began to clear as I approached the Colorado border, and in the growing dawn light, I could see the convoy more clearly than ever. The trucks were definitely from another era. Cab-over designs that had gone out of production in the 80s. Paint schemes and company logos I didn't recognize. Equipment that looked like it belonged in a transportation museum rather than on a modern highway. Some of the trailers had old-style lettering painted on their sides, advertising companies that had probably been out of business for decades. That's when I realized what I was looking at. These weren't modern trucks at all. They were the ghosts of an older convoy, drivers who had died on this same stretch of highway years or maybe decades ago, still following their route through storms that had claimed their lives. I thought about all the truckers who had died on I-70 over the years, jackknifed in blizzards, frozen in their cabs when their heaters failed, lost in whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible. As full daylight broke over the Colorado plains, the convoy began to fade. One by one, the trucks became translucent, their bright headlights dimming until they were barely visible against the pale morning sky. By the time I reached the Denver delivery dock, they had disappeared completely, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined the entire experience. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Other drivers have reported similar sightings over the years, phantom convoys following them through dangerous weather, ghostly truckers still running their routes long after death claimed them. The Highway Patrol doesn't keep records of supernatural encounters, but drivers do. We share these stories at truck stops and over CB radios, warnings about stretches of road where the dead still drive, still follow the living through storms that claimed their lives decades ago. I've driven that same route dozens of times since then, but I've never seen the phantom convoy again. Sometimes, though, when the weather turns really bad and the snow starts falling thick enough to blind you, I catch glimpses in my mirrors, faint lights in the distance, following just far enough back to stay out of clear sight, waiting for the right conditions to fully manifest. And I wonder how many drivers are out there on the dark highways, still running loads they'll never deliver, following convoys they'll never catch up to, trapped forever in the worst storms of their lives. My name is Tommy Rodriguez, and I've been driving trucks for 21 years. In all that time, I've fueled up at hundreds of truck stops across the country, from the gleaming megaplexes with their restaurants and shower facilities to the grimy little mom-and-pop operations that look like they haven't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. But I'd never encountered anything like what happened to me at that truck stop outside of Bakersfield, California, in March of 2006. It was the kind of experience that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. And I still wake up some nights with the sound of my own name being whispered through a fuel nozzle. I was hauling a load of produce from Salinas to Phoenix, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of delays at the loading dock. My fuel gauge was sitting just above a quarter tank, which meant I had maybe 100 miles before I'd be running on fumes. When I saw the signs for Murphy's Truck Plaza, I decided to top off and grab some coffee before making the final push through the desert. The place looked typical enough. A dozen diesel pumps arranged in 2 rows, a main building with the usual convenience store setup, and parking for about 50 trucks. Nothing fancy, but clean and well-maintained. I pulled up to pump number 6, which was at the end of the row farthest from the main building. The pump looked older than the others, with that weathered gray paint and analog gauges that belonged to an earlier era of trucking. But it appeared to be in working order, so I shut down my engine and climbed out to start the fueling process. The desert air was cool and dry, typical for March in that part of California, and the truck stop was relatively quiet except for the distant hum of refrigeration units and the occasional rumble of trucks pulling in and out of the lot. I swiped my fuel card and selected diesel, waiting for the usual authorization process to complete. But instead of the familiar beep and green light, Pump 6 just sat there for a moment, its display flickering different readings like it couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to show me. Then, without any input from me, it suddenly sprang to life. The nozzle handle lifted itself out of the holster. The display showed Authorite, and diesel began flowing into my tank. At first, I thought it was just a mechanical quirk, maybe some kind of automatic fueling system I wasn't familiar with. But as I stood there watching the gallons tick by, on the pump display, I realized something was very wrong. The nozzle was dispensing fuel, but I hadn't inserted it into my tank yet. It was just hanging in the air next to my truck. Diesel pouring out onto the concrete in a steady stream that should have triggered every safety system in the place. I reached for the nozzle to shut it off, but the moment my fingers touched the metal handle, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice was coming through the nozzle, barely audible over the sound of flowing fuel, but definitely human. It was whispering my name, over and over again, in a tone that was both familiar and completely alien. Tommy Rodriguez. Tommy. The voice was thin and reedy, like it was traveling through miles of pipe to reach me. But it knew my name, my full name, and it was speaking with an intimacy that suggested we'd met before. I jerked my hand back from the nozzle, but the voice continued, growing slightly louder and more insistent. I looked around the truck stop, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate practical joke, but the few other drivers I could see were going about their business normally, fueling their rigs and heading into the store for supplies. Nobody seemed to notice that Pump 6 was dispensing diesel onto the ground, while carrying on a one-sided conversation with a customer who was standing 3 feet away from it. Tommy, don't be afraid, the voice whispered through the nozzle. I've been waiting for you. Waiting such a long time. There was something about the cadence of the speech that triggered a memory. A vague recollection of someone I'd known years ago. But I couldn't place it, couldn't connect the whispered words to any face or name from my past. I tried walking away from Pump 6, thinking I'd just move to another pump and report the malfunction to the store manager. But as I turned to leave, the fuel flow stopped abruptly and the voice became more urgent. Don't go, Tommy. Please, don't leave me here, alone again. I've been waiting in the dark for so long. Against my better judgment, I've sadness mixed with the desperation. You were there when it happened. You were there when I fell. That's when the memory hit me like a physical blow. Eddie Morales, my partner during my first year of driving. We'd been fueling up at a truck stop outside of Tucson, and Eddie had been horsing around, trying to top off his tank in record time. The nozzle had malfunctioned, spraying diesel everywhere, and Eddie had slipped on the wet concrete. He'd hit his head on the concrete island so hard that I could hear the crack from 20 feet away. He died in the hospital 3 days later, never regaining consciousness. "Eddie," I whispered. "You remember," the voice said, and I could hear relief in the whispered words. "You left me there, Tommy. You drove away and left me there. Eddie, you died 15 years ago. I went to your funeral. This isn't real. I'm trapped, Tommy. Trapped in the fuel, in the pumps, in every truck stop between here and there. Every time someone fills up, I feel it flowing through me. Every gallon that passes through these systems, I'm part of it. And I've been waiting for you to come back." The fuel nozzle began moving on its own, swinging back and forth like a pendulum, spraying diesel in wide arcs across the concrete. Other drivers finally started to notice, shouting warnings and running for cover. But the voice coming through the nozzle was getting louder, more frantic. "Take me with you, Tommy. Put the nozzle in your tank and take me with you. I don't want to be alone anymore. I don't want to be trapped in the dark with nothing but the sound of fuel flowing through my body." I backed away from the pump, horrified by what I was hearing. The idea of carrying Eddie's ghost in my fuel tank, of having his trapped spirit travel with me on every delivery, was more terrifying than I could process. But the voice kept calling my name, pleading with me not to abandon him again. The truck stop manager finally arrived with a maintenance crew, and they managed to shut down Pump 6 from some kind of emergency control panel. The diesel stopped flowing, the nozzle settled back into its holster, and the voice fell silent. The manager apologized profusely for the malfunction, offered to pay for cleaning my truck, and assured me that the pump would be taken out of service until they could determine what had caused the problem. I fueled up at Pump 4 instead, keeping my eyes fixed on the numbers rolling by on the display, trying not to think about Eddie's voice or the impossible things he'd told me. But as I finished up and prepared to leave, I could swear I heard one last whisper coming through the fuel system. The fuel systems, speaking to me through nozzles and pumps across a dozen states. Sometimes the voices of other dead drivers join his, all of them trapped in the infrastructure of the highways they died on, all of them calling out to the living drivers who pass through their domain. And every time I fuel up, every time I hear that familiar sound of diesel flowing through the hose, I listen for whispers that shouldn't be there, voices that should have fallen silent years ago. My name is David Miller, and I've been a long-haul trucker for 14 years. I thought I knew every town, every delivery address, and every back road between California and Maine. I've hauled everything from furniture to farm equipment, delivered to places so remote they don't show up on most maps, and navigated by nothing but handwritten directions and local landmarks. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the delivery I made to Hollow Pines in October of 2007, a town that, according to every map and GPS system I checked afterward, doesn't exist and never has. I was hauling a load of antique furniture and household goods from an estate sale in Sacramento to what my dispatcher told me was a private collector in Hollow Pines, somewhere in the mountains of Northern California. The paperwork looked standard enough. Delivery address, contact information, special handling instructions for some of the more valuable pieces. The customer had paid in advance, cash on the barrelhead, which wasn't unusual for high-end antique deliveries. Rich collectors often preferred to keep their transactions private, and cash payments meant no paper trail for insurance or tax purposes. What was unusual was the delivery address itself. Instead of a street number and name, I had directions that read like something from a treasure map. Take Highway 299 west to mile marker 47, Turn north on the unmarked gravel road. Follow for 8.3 miles until you see the stone bridge. Continue 2.1 miles to the town square. No street address. No zip code. Just these cryptic directions that relied on landmarks and mileage counts. But I'd delivered to remote locations before, places where the postal service didn't reach and UPS drivers feared to tread. I left Sacramento just after midnight, planning to make the delivery first thing in the morning, and then head south for my next pickup in Los Angeles. The drive through the Sacramento Valley was routine, just dark farmland and sleeping towns strung along the interstate like pearls on a wire. But when I turned onto Highway 299 and started climbing into the mountains, something felt different about the landscape. The trees seemed older and taller than they should have been, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my headlights barely penetrated the darkness between them. I found mile marker 47 without any trouble, and sure enough, looked like virgin forest. My GPS immediately lost its signal, which wasn't unusual in mountainous terrain. But the silence was so complete that I couldn't even pick up distant radio stations on my CB. It was like I'd driven into a dead zone, where modern technology simply didn't work. The gravel road was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my trailer to navigate without scraping against the massive pine trees that pressed in from both sides. I had to take it slow, maybe 15 miles per hour, fighting my steering wheel as the road twisted through terrain that seemed designed to keep outsiders away. After exactly 8.3 miles, I found the stone bridge mentioned in my directions. An old arch made of fitted stones that looked like it belonged in medieval Europe, rather than the California mountains. The final 2.1 miles took me through the strangest landscape I'd ever seen. The forest opened up into a valley that couldn't have been more than a mile across, surrounded by peaks that seemed impossibly tall and steep. And there, nestled in the center of the valley, like something from a fairy tale, was Hollow Pines. It was a town from another era, maybe the 1920s or 1930s, with buildings that looked like they'd been preserved in amber. Victorian houses with wraparound porches lined tree-shaded streets, their paint fresh, and their gardens perfectly maintained. A white church steeple rose above the town center, and I could see what looked like a general store, a barber shop, and a small hotel arranged around a central square, complete with a gazebo and fountain. Warm yellow light glowed from windows throughout the town, giving the whole place a welcoming, lived-in feel. I drove through the quiet streets, looking for someone to ask directions to my final delivery address. But despite the lights in the windows and the well-maintained appearance of everything, I didn't see a single person walking the sidewalks or working in the gardens. It was like the entire population had simply vanished, leaving behind a perfectly preserved ghost town that still somehow felt alive and occupied. Finally, I reached the town square and saw a man in a dark suit standing next to the fountain. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of formal bearing that suggested he was someone important in the community. When he saw my truck, he walked over with a smile and waved me to a stop. "You must be David Miller," he said when I rolled down my window. His voice had a strange quality to it, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well, but his manner was friendly and professional. "We've been expecting you. I'm Mayor Harrison. If you'll follow me, I'll show you where to unload the first household item I was delivering seemed to match the period architecture perfectly. Antique sofas, hand-carved dining tables, Persian rugs, oil paintings and gilded frames. Everything looked like it had been specifically chosen to furnish a house from the early 20th century. The unloading process was strange, because Mayor Harrison seemed to be my only help, but somehow we managed to move everything into the house with an ease that defied the weight and bulk of some of the pieces. He signed my delivery receipt with a fountain pen, using handwriting that looked like old-fashioned script, and handed me an envelope containing what he said was a tip for my excellent service. As I prepared to leave Hollow Pines, Mayor Harrison shook my hand and thanked me for making the delivery. "You've brought these items home where they belong," he said. "Some things are meant to be in certain places, with certain people, regardless of how much time has passed." There was something in his eyes when he said this, a depth of knowledge that made me feel like he understood secrets I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The drive out of the valley was just as winding and treacherous as the drive in, but I made it back to Highway 299 without incident. As soon as I reached the main road, my GPS signal returned. My CB crackled back to life, and I could pick up radio stations from Sacramento and San Francisco. It was like crossing back into the modern world after visiting some kind of temporal anomaly. 3 days later, I was back home in Phoenix when I got a call from my dispatcher. "David, I need to ask you about that delivery to Hollow Pines. The customer is saying they never received their furniture, and the check they sent us bounced. Are you sure you delivered to the right address?" I told him about Mayor Harrison, about the Victorian house, about the signed delivery receipt. But when I went to get the paperwork from my truck, I found something that made my blood run cold. The delivery receipt was signed all right, but it was dated October 15th, 1927. The signature read, "Jonathan Harrison, Mayor of Hollow Pines." But the ink looked fresh, like it had been signed yesterday, and the envelope he'd given me as a tip contained $20 in bills that, according to the dates on them, had been printed in 1925. I've tried to find Hollow Pines again, following the same route, looking for the stone bridge and the gravel road, but all I ever find is unbroken forest. No road, no bridge, no valley hidden between the peaks. Every map I check shows nothing but wilderness in that area, and the local Forest Service has no record of any town called Hollow Pines ever existing in Northern California. Exactly the right time. Because somewhere out there, in a valley that doesn't appear on any map, there's a town full of people who ordered furniture from 1927 and finally got their delivery 80 years late.